Hello, I'm Michael Lambert, a fellow in social inequalities here at Lancaster University, and today I'm asking more about researching inequalities with members of the centre. So can I begin by asking, who are you? Who am I speaking with?
I'm Laura Clancy. I'm a lecturer in media in the sociology department, and I'm also director of the Centre for Gender and Women's Studies.
And what is it that you do?
So my research is very broadly is on the British monarchy. And it thinks about issues around the monarchy, power, wealth, media representations, and inequalities. So I've written a book called Running the Family Firm, a number of journal articles connected to that theme. And the book really argues, it makes this connection between the political economy of monarchy, so thinking about their wealth, thinking about their funding, thinking about who works for them and all those kind of questions. So kind of like investigative journalism type focus, and then combines that with quite traditional British cultural studies ideas of media representations. So thinking about how media representations of the royal family might produce consent, as Stuart Hall would say, for these inequalities and for that kind of political economy. So thinking about the well, I call it cultural political economy. So thinking about those two relationships. So I look in the book, I look at issues around kind of land ownership and gender. There's a chapter about Prince Harry and the war on terror and things like that. So thinking about all of these issues of inequality that we can read through the royal family. And kind of the key argument of the book is that we can think about the royal family as or the monarchy rather, as a corporation. So I call them the firm. So I think about how, there's so much research at the moment around kind of contemporary inequalities, about the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, all of these conversations. And part of my argument is that the monarchy is not part of that. The monarchy is not usually considered as part of that conversation. So I insert the monarchy into that by thinking about them in terms of the firm, in terms of corporate power. And I kind of open the book by talking about the Paradise Papers. So that's a kind of a very obvious example where the monarchy was implicated and people like Apple and Amazon were implicated. So a really simple way for us to make that comparison between different corporations.
And I think it will be fair to say that this research, particularly for your book, is based from your doctoral thesis, a lot of work you undertook then. But it's in very high demand, having this kind of connected expertise between the monarchy, representations, those corporate images, but also it's very high profile, both nationally and internationally, things that take place that has been in such high demand. And I've seen you in a lot of places and elsewhere. But can you talk a little bit more about that kind of public facing side of what you do in relation to the royal family? Because I think a lot of people would be very interested, particularly in how it relates to inequalities.
Yeah, so I've done quite a bit of media work. It's a very strange experience. It never stops being a strange experience. But I've done quite a bit around, everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone knows about it. Even if you're just on kind of having your hair cut and someone says, well, what do you look at? And you say the monarchy, everybody has an opinion. So it's kind of a topic that was always going to get a bit of attention, probably. Not that I realised that when I started doing it. So I've been on BBC Newsnight. I've done interviews for newspapers in Japan, in America, radio in Australia, the major newspapers in the UK, so like the Daily Mail, Telegraph, like that, picked up on a piece I'd written with my colleague Hannah Yellin, who works at Oxford Brookes, and we wrote about Meghan Markle, and they picked up on that. That was an experience and a half. And then I've kind of I respond to various press requests from all over, really. This week I've spoken to Open Democracy, for example. So they kind of just come in through email, and I just respond to them and link in what's happening in popular culture, so kind of what everyone else is seeing, and try and link that with the ideas that I've spoken about in my book. As this, often on these things, they might have royal correspondents commenting on it, or other journalists. So to have that slightly different perspective from an academic perspective, although I try, obviously it can't be too academic, I kind of try to bridge that gap.
So, and this kind of links nicely into the next question, because the way you describe yourself was this is kind of investigative, muckraking journalist, effectively. And so how do you go about doing what you do? What are the kinds of methods, sources, approaches that you kind of adopt in order to get under the skin of this issue?
Yes, that's actually quite hard for this topic because, I mean, obviously I didn't get to speak to any of them. I would have loved to. And I did want to speak to staff, but they sign very tight non-disclosure agreements. So that was never going to happen either. So I kind of had to think about how to do this without actually speaking to anybody. It's also really hard because the monarchy as an institution is, not liable to particular freedom of information requests and things like that. So often that information isn't publicly available. So I kind of just had to, I did a lot of research on the internet. That was a lot of the time, kind of piecing information together, kind of fitting a story together, particularly in the chapter that talks about the staff. So I kind of map particular staff that work for them and talk about those staff's histories. And a lot of that was around kind of just searching their name on the internet and then kind of following the thread of where that would take me and kind of trying to fit together into something that seemed reliable because it come from multiple sources, or getting something from something like Wikipedia, which obviously isn't reliable, but then trying to confirm that elsewhere through other ways. So doing this I would call it investigative journalism research, because it is similar to what I think journalists would do in terms of piecing together this quite complicated information into something that is more coherent. So it was a lot of that. So a lot of searching. I've got loads of material that I kind of pieced together, and that's stuff from the internet. But that's also things like if I saw a magazine or a newspaper, I'd buy that. Or if I went to an event, I would kind of collect memorabilia and stuff from the event. Or I've ordered stuff on eBay before that was kind of historical that you could collect. So just kind of collecting all of this stuff. And part of the way I kind of talk about that is that I'm interested in, part of what the book is interested in is representation. So partly it kind of doesn't matter whether it's true in any truth, that's kind of not, for part of it, that's not relevant. It doesn't matter what the Queen really thinks about something to me. What I'm interested in, how that's represented. So by collecting that material, you can kind of understand that representation.
What I find really interesting from how you're sort of describing that is the way that the monarchy is perhaps, the most significant symbol, kind of well recognized, and yet trying to assemble information about its workings within inside it is incredibly difficult, and that has caused you to kind of work around it and assemble this bigger picture. And I think that's absolutely fascinating in and of itself, and the kind of creative approaches and methods you've had to adopt as a result of that.
And I think that tells the story in itself that it's hard. So part of the story that I told in the book was it's really hard to collect this, and that in itself is a problem, and that in itself is part of the story. So it's almost like that difficulty was part of the analysis, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And so can I ask, I know you've already mentioned this sort of before already, but just perhaps a bit more detail or more of an example of the relationship between your work and inequalities, perhaps how you think about inequalities from the things you've been saying earlier on.
Yeah. So where I started with this project was I was quite interested in class inequality in particular. That's kind of what I started researching as like an MA student, and that was where my interest is really. And kind of thinking about, when I read this, in particular, there's a lot of research nowadays on the elites and the 1% or the super rich, whatever you want to call them. That's a really growing topic of research, really important topic of research. But part of my argument is that the monarchy is not considered as part of that, and it should be. So part of my book is part of the argument. There's a sentence that goes, something like, we can't understand inequalities in Britain without understanding monarchy. Partly because, of course, like nowadays, they're literally the 1%, right? They're 0.001%. That's that, but also that they kind of underpin. So my argument is they kind of shore up that system, because people always say, well, the Brits are obsessed with class. Well, is it any wonder when we literally have this elite family enshrined into what we understand about ourselves and national identity? So part of the argument is around this fact that they kind of shore up those systems, and representations of them are really important. If you have this spectacular version of monarchy that we see, the part of the question is what we don't see, and my argument is, well, what we don't see is kind of the aristocrats and the stuff that are part of the same class system but are hidden because of that spectacular function of the monarchy. So how all of that is part of this same system of elites, I suppose.
I think that's a really good exposition of thinking about how to kind of grasp at the topic, particularly sort of in the back of my mind, those kinds of longer histories of the monarchy, you know, before sort of modern capitalism, and looking at this kind of longer form of elite and sort of systemic control. I think it's absolutely fascinating. It couldn't be more timely, I think, in the current climate.
Yeah.
So can I conclude just by asking, beyond the kind of scope of your research, the kinds of organizations, associations, stakeholders or partners that you're involved with as part of your research?
Yeah, so my main partners would be media. So I have quite a few contacts in the media. I've done, as I said, I've done quite a bit of media work. I've worked quite a lot with the BBC, particularly BBC Radio, quite a lot with, I want to call it left-wing publications online, with people like Red Pepper, Open Democracy.
Yeah.
So the kind of people who might be interested in the questions that I'm asking. And that's also, as I said, international. So I've done a bit of work with Japan, Germany, France, Australia, those kind of people. So a lot of that is quite like popular culture text. So, you know, things you'd actually like BBC Newsnight and stuff that people would just listen to. So it's not necessarily a partner, but I've worked with them quite a lot. Yeah, so that's probably my main connection to groups. And
for me, I think that's a real way of the relevance and salience of your research, and why it's kind of engagement and kind of impact is almost built into the very things that you're involved in doing, sort of from the beginning to end.
Yeah, and people are always interested in, and the thing is, once you kind of talk to one person, then they tend to see it and then ask more, so it kind of snowballs from there. And I think it's always going to be a relevant topic. Everyone's always going to want to talk about this, and that's always going to be the case. You know, as we have these bigger events, like the Meghan and Harry thing. I did quite a lot of work when Meghan and Harry, the Oprah interview was my busiest week ever. You know, as we see, like when Prince Philip died, I think the kind of big events, there's always going to be these moments when they need these commentators. And I think it is quite different to have someone from university come and do that rather than a journalist or something like that. So I think it does give a slightly different perspective on that. And it's also obviously really good for me to kind of get my work out there and make sure it's not just speaking to academics, make sure it is speaking to much broader audiences, because everyone's interested in this topic and everyone knows about it. So surely there's a much broader conversation to be had.
Absolutely. Laura, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today about your research and its relationship to inequalities.
Thank you.